Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this preview webcast of Strata New York. We started the Strata conference series early this year in February in Santa Clara and had an amazing response, a sellout show. And one of the reasons that we're doing Strata is that we recognize that what's going on with data in the world now, with our ability to process large amounts of scruffy data in an experimental way as well as an ordered way, is leading to a change in business and in society and in what it means for us personally. It's now so much cheaper to get value out of data. You know, the industrial or commercial giants of the last 10 years, Walmart, McDonald's, and so on, they were able to afford the means of extracting value from their big data. But now we're in an era where that's available to so many more of us, and it's changing how we think, and it's changing how even you might think the more normal aspects of doing business and living our lives are concerned. So I'm very glad to have a faculty of speakers this morning drawn from the various three events in Strata, New York. But before we go on, I'm just going to give a word about our sponsor, who is EMC. EMC have been great supporters of the Strata conference right from the beginning. One of the interesting things about this is that Scott Yara, who's the CEO of Greenplum and now part of EMC, was lobbying Tim O'Reilly for about 3 years to do a data conference. And it was great to have him at our opening in February to kind of tell the story of where this new discipline called data science had come from. And so thanks very much to them, and should point out there they have a bunch of products really aimed for big data processing in the enterprise. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker this morning, who is Mike Nelson. Michael comes from the Leading Edge Forum. One of the interesting things that captivated me about what Michael's going to talk about is the way he's leaning in to what's happening with data right now. In this age of WikiLeaks, you can't really contain the information that your company has, and leaking is becoming an unavoidable part of life. So he's going to talk to us about how actually you can turn that to your advantage and what business ought to do in an age where information flows freely. So Michael is part of our Jumpstart faculty who are going to be speaking on the 19th of September in New York, and I'm glad to turn it over to him now. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm very glad to be on the program for Jumpstart and very glad to have a chance to try to compress all my key points into about 15 or 20 minutes this morning. I've been working here in Washington for about 23 years, and I've only recently joined the CSC Leading Edge Forum. Prior to that, I worked in the Clinton White House. I worked before that in the Senate, and I spent a lot of time working at IBM. And in all of these situations, there was this great desire to control information, to understand exactly who was talking to whom, how information was being shared. But the game is changing, and one of the topics that I think we need to focus a lot more on is how we deal with big data in the era of WikiLeaks. And in particular, how you develop a transparency strategy. Rather than letting your employees and former employees and disgruntled employees leak information out to the press or to their blogs or to Twitter, companies have to have a proactive policy for sharing more of the data that in the past they've always assumed they were just going to sit on. This talk that I'm doing is the result of a project I've been working on for about 5 months for the forum. I'm almost wrapping it up, but it's part of ongoing research, and I would invite anybody on the call who has a particular story about transparency or strategic leaking to send me a note at mnelson@pobox.com or mnelson@leadingedgeforum.com. This is a relatively new phenomenon, but it's one that's going to be, I think, more and more important in the coming months and years. I've worked with Tim O'Reilly for about 20 years, and I've always been impressed with how he spots a trend early, gets the right people together to talk about it, and really helps drive the debate. And I think that's what's going to happen here is we talk more about big data and particularly talk about transparency. The first slide here shows what's really going on. There's this explosion in the amount of data that companies collect and store. At the same time, there's more and more necessity to share information, both throughout the company and with business partners. We've seen that in government after 9/11, huge focus on data sharing between the agencies working on anti-terrorism, but it's happening throughout the economy as companies outsource more and more of their core functions. And that means that the amount of control that companies have over that information is inevitably going to decrease. You can do a better job with cybersecurity. You can do a better job of understanding who has access to what. But at the end of the day, your ability to make sure that nothing goes out the door that you don't want to go out the door is going to go down. Next slide is just to remind us about WikiLeaks, which I think is a great case study in what's really going on. Government agencies had to share the information that was in the databases that were leaked in the WikiLeaks incident. They had to get that data out to about 500,000 people who were in the business of tracking possible terrorist threats, trying to understand what was going on in the Middle East. There was a real need to get that data out, and at the same time, they didn't do a good enough job of making sure that all 500,000 people who had access to those databases were monitored properly. And so just one of them, Bradley Manning, was able to leak more than 250,000 documents and cause all sorts of embarrassment for the U.S. State Department and for governments around the world. What's interesting about that is the reaction. The first reaction was from governments was panic and just a real focus on locking everything down. They went even further and tried to actually impede or block what WikiLeaks was doing. That hasn't prevented a lot of other groups from popping up that are doing the same thing as WikiLeaks, including the Wall Street Journal and Al Jazeera. Businesses have responded to WikiLeaks by asking the question, what if this happened to us? And their reaction, of course, has been to lock things down. But that's not actually the right reaction. And some companies are looking at the WikiLeaks story and realizing that actually there's a lot of data that they've been locking down that they shouldn't be locking down. There's information that's going to get out, and they might as well let it get out and make sure it gets out in the right form to the right people. There was a great article in The Economist back in February. It came out just a few weeks before we started this project called The Leaky Corporation. And it really looks at this new environment and explains, as only The Economist can, what the trends are and what some examples of how this is happening. There's lots of reasons to be more transparent, to share more information. This 2x2 matrix gives you a sense of the benefits. On the vertical axis, you have value creation. If you share more data with your customers, with your partners, and if you share more data externally, it also ends up being more accessible to your own employees. If you do that, you can get more new services out the door. You can work more closely with your partners. You can generate a lot of publicity. And one of the big intangible benefits is trust. If you were telling people what you're doing about tell people about the new services you're developing, if you're showing them how you operate and what your corporate ethic is, there's going to be a higher degree of trust. The other big benefit of transparency, of course, is accountability. If you're telling the world what you're doing, you're going to be more accountable. If your employees have their name out there on blog postings describing what they're doing, they're going to have to be more accountable, more productive, more creative. So these are the two focus areas that we've looked at in this report, and both of them are incredibly important. They're important not just for businesses, but also for governments and nonprofits. Different companies are going to have different reasons to become more transparent. But the bottom line here is that they're going to be more transparent whether they want to or not. And I would argue that we're going to see a lot more cases like WikiLeaks. There's a lot more bloggers out there trying to figure out what's going on inside a company. And with social media, there's a lot more ways for information to leak out. We recently had a case where a vice president at Hewlett-Packard updated his LinkedIn profile and just happened to mention a great, exciting new project that he was working on in cloud computing. He was actually the point person on the project. Well, that wasn't a public program. It wasn't supposed to be out. They hadn't announced it yet. And that's just, again, one little example of how social media is changing the way in which information leaves companies. In this talk I'm giving in September, I'll be looking at 9 different areas of transparency. And they range from the C-suite. The first item, of course, is what is the CEO thinking, and the CFO and the CIO. There's been a lot of talk about this over the last 10 years, starting with Don Tapscott in his book, The Naked Corporation. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to focus on some of the other areas that are getting more attention now. The second topic is about research, sharing your new product ideas, sharing your source code. Third area of transparency is about your personnel. Startups are particularly good at that, showing people the bios and projects that each employee is involved in. In some cases, even sharing compensation numbers, telling people what your employees get paid. That's kind of extreme, but there are companies that practice radical transparency. They let the whole world know what's going on. Fourth item is sales goals and figures, telling the world product by product how well they're selling and how successful they are. Fifth item is a very rich topic, and it's one I'll spend a lot of time talking about in my talk at Jumpstart, and that is about customer data, usually anonymized and aggregated. But there's a lot of very exciting projects going on where taking all the data from customers, not just sales, but preferences and the rest, companies are able to provide back to their customers very detailed profiles of what different customers are doing, providing information on everything from what books sell best on Amazon to what's the favorite restaurant in your neighborhood. The sixth item is customer complaints and resolution. Again, this is being forced upon companies. If you don't publicize the comments and critiques that you're getting and show what you've done about them, you're missing an opportunity, because those complaints are going to be on Yelp or TripAdvisor or Angie's List or some of these consumer sites, whether you take action or not. Ninth item is pricing and purchasing data. Again, this varies with industry, but there are places where companies are doing a much better job of being transparent about exactly what their prices are, and customers appreciate that, often leading to increased sales, if not increased profit. Eighth item is just everyday operations, and this, again, is a very rich and sort of grab bag topic, but there are more and more opportunities for companies to share with the world the kind of information they get on their corporate dashboards, to put webcams at their various facilities, and just let the world know how things work. I'll say more about this shortly. And then the last point is crisis response, particularly important in a crisis, whether it's an oil spill in the Gulf or a product recall, to be out there, to be transparent, to be seen as being open and honest. And if a company has a reputation already for being transparent, it's much easier to respond when the crisis comes. I think that by being more transparent, companies can really resolve an issue that they've been facing for more than 20 years, and that is the tension between the amount of information that customers are willing to share and the amount of information that vendors want to get. If you're running an e-commerce site, you need to know who you're talking to. You'd like to know a lot of different information to establish identity, phone number, address, social security number, credit card, and the rest. And customers, of course, would prefer to be anonymous or to share as little as possible. So this diagram is sort of where we've been for the last 20 years, and governments are in this debate. They're trying to set standards and decide what information can be shared and should be shared. The next slide just shows some of the benefits that a vendor gets by having more personalized information. They can customize the offerings, they can generate more profits by doing that, and of course they can cut down on fraud. But again, customers would prefer to be on the left side of this diagram for protecting their privacy, sharing as little as possible. So I think transparency is sort of the answer to this problem. If we get away from a one-dimensional debate and we add in a second dimension, we start talking about transparency of processes and systems. If companies share information about what they're doing with your data, you're going to be more willing to share data. I call this mutually assured disclosure, and it's a form of strategic leaking. If I'm Amazon and I share with you all the information I have on your purchases, and then tell me how that data is being used, how it's being aggregated, how customized offerings are possible because I've shared that information, I'm much more willing to share information and perhaps move off of my stance of sharing as little as possible. So this is one of the benefits. I'm not going to go onto this next slide very much, but it's an attempt to look at what influences how transparent a company can be. The most important factor that we found in the study is CEO and board commitment to more openness. And often it takes a top-down effort to open up the company. And a number of the case studies that I'll be examining started that way. But there are other factors. In an industry where things are changing very fast, there's more and more interest in what's going on, what companies are developing, so more and more pressure to be open. In companies where you're working, you have a very intense relationship with a customer, where you're selling things every few days or at least every few weeks, there's going to be interest in how the company operates. On the other hand, if you're an insurance company and maybe you renew a policy once a year, there may be less interest in that kind of thing. So I won't go through all of this, but this is something I'll explore in New York. So the next slide is just an example of some of the case studies that I explore. The first one is an old example. It's a company called Simco. Ricardo Simler was the CEO of that. He took over the company, which is a high-tech manufacturing company in Brazil, when he was 24 years old. And at the time, the company was very top-down, very hierarchical. Everything was on a need-to-know basis, and he completely changed the culture. He announced that they were just going to make everything available. They were going to share salary information, product plans. He fired about two-thirds of his staff, his senior direct reports, and just changed the way the company worked. The assumption was information would be shared internally and externally, and the incredible growth rate, just a very dramatic increase in the amount of attention the company got, and it became much easier for them to recruit people as well. Another example they use is Custom Ink. It's a custom T-shirt printing company right here in Falls Church, Virginia. It has the largest chunk of that market, and they've been very transparent about the complaints they get and put that right on their home page as a way to highlight what they're doing to ensure quality. Intuit is a good example of a company that's using customer data to generate more services for their own customers. So if you go to data.mint.com, you can see how Intuit customers are spending their money. And I can find out which are the most popular restaurants among Mint.com customers in Arlington, Virginia, where I live. Or if I'm looking for a car repair shop, I can get a sense of which ones are most expensive based on how large the bills are of the various people who are using the service in my area. Another example is the Netflix prize, which you're probably familiar with. Netflix decided they wanted to do a better job of predicting what movies their customers would enjoy viewing. And so they made available a large chunk, millions of records, hundreds of millions of records from millions of customers. And then they challenged anybody who was interested to come up with a better algorithm for determining which movies people would like based on what other movies they've liked in the past. And this was a very creative use of anonymized data, which led to a much better algorithm as well as a lot of publicity. Cost them $1 million in prize money, and they probably got tens of millions of dollars worth of creative research done as a result. So the bottom line is that you really need to have a transparency strategy, a conscious, well-thought-out strategy for sharing more information. It's really just the opposite of the security strategy and the privacy and compliance policies that companies already have. Those are focused on controlling what information goes where. This has to be the flip side of the coin. How do you take the information that has always been treated as confidential and make it available and benefit from it and leverage it? When I was in the Clinton White House, we had a very simple rule, which was put it on the web unless there's a good reason not to. And Obama went one further. In his very first executive order, they set out a transparency strategy that said, we're going to make data available and we're going to put it in a format that people can use easily. Implementation's been hard, but they certainly have made some steps there, and the top-down leadership has been helpful. So what do you do? In this talk, I'm focusing primarily on management and culture, not so much on bits and bytes. But one thing you obviously need to do is you have to get a team together that includes the key parts of the company, from the IT office to the human resources office, communications, public relations, and legal. I have to sit down and think, okay, what data do we have that we should be making available? And think about pilot projects that can actually demonstrate the power of sharing. One place to go for some information on how to do this is a group called World Blue, BLU, which has actually created transparency metrics that allow companies to measure themselves and determine how transparent they are and how they could become more open and transparent. There are lots of implications for IT infrastructure. I won't have time to go into all of them, but clearly you need to have better identity management so you know who you're talking to, who you're sharing with, both internally and externally. A real big challenge is getting more fine-grained access control. So rather than just giving everybody in a certain part of the company access to all the databases in a particular area, you might end up giving a lot more people access to those databases, but not giving them access to all of the database. So certain columns might only be available with passwords, or there might be a particular high level of security for those particular pieces of the database, which might include social security numbers, credit cards, and the like. The real challenge here is to move from the old model, where you had a little bit of very high-risk information. In some cases, this is intellectual property. Other cases, it's financial results, personnel data. And then you had everything else in the company that was internal and was confidential and was treated that way, and that was supposed to stay inside the company. And then you had press releases and web postings, and tightly controlled by the PR organization. The new model, very different. You still have the high-risk information. You might even have more than you used to have. It has to be treated very carefully. But then you also have a lot of information you're going to want to get out the door, and you're going to allow to go out the door. Let me show this in a graphical form. In a typical company, you have a lot of different information assets, and the value of those assets and the amount of damage that could be done if they were leaked varies. So as you go from left, this is actually a slide from one of my colleagues at the Leading Edge Forum, Adrian Secombe, and he's trying to show how different types of information can cause damage if they're released. In this classic approach, everything is treated as confidential. There's a rather high expense in trying to protect everything in the company. And then there's the really special stuff that needs extra protection and extra expense is needed. The result is, though, a lot of money is wasted putting high levels of control on information that could be publicly available. And so one of the big challenges here is to go to a more multi-tiered classification scheme and a multi-tiered security policy so that you accept that a lot of information, routine information about the company, and it might be personnel information about bios and who's working on what. It may be some information on products. It may even be some anonymized customer data. That information you should be ready to let out the door, perhaps even put out the door. So this is a big challenge and one that a few companies are starting to grapple with already. And that leads me to my last slide, which is really a slide of next practices. At CSC and the Leading Edge Forum, we don't focus on best practices. We try to look at next practices. What are the emerging protocols and procedures that companies are using to tackle new opportunities and to meet new challenges? Obviously, as I said, there is a need to bring together the key players and to actually ask the question, what data should we be protecting? What data do we need to protect? And then going further down the line to develop strategies for training employees and for taking advantage of transparency. So I know I've almost run out of time. I do see one question here about my very first chart, which is showing how control is going down. I want to stress I'm not saying that things are out of control. Clearly, if you make the investment, you can control the data that you need to control. But there is so much data that information is going to leak out. And some of it is information you won't collect. There are going to be people collecting data about your company just by watching you, by watching web traffic, by putting webcams up. I mean, you have bloggers who are following Apple engineers into bars and listening to their conversations. There's so many ways in which information is leaking out. So the diagram, just going back to that diagram, the reason that such a sharp descent in the control curve is because I was trying to measure the likelihood that you will control everything that leaks out of your company. It just isn't possible. And so you need this strategy for strategic leaking to get more people informed about what you're doing, to build trust, build buzz, and make better use of the data you have. So I hope that gives you a preview of what I'm going to talk about. And again, if people have questions and would like more detail on this or learn more about how to get copies of the reports that we're working on in this area, you can send me a note at mnelson@leadingedgeforum.com. I'll also post that in the chat room. So thank you very much,
Michael. So, thank you. Really appreciate your presentation. I love the phrase "mutually assured disclosure," which I think is definitely one that captures the imagination. We're going to move on shortly to our next speaker, but I had one question for you, which I guess you must get a lot. Apple Computer seems to be a strong counterexample to what you're saying in terms of their fervent strategy of control, and they don't seem to be doing too badly on it.
Well, it's interesting. One of the other examples I point to is Google. Google's also famous. Stephen Levy wrote this wonderful book called In the Plex, and he compared Google to a lobster. Very hard shell on the outside, and very open and soft on the inside. So I think Google has an approach that is probably most relevant to a lot of companies. They're struggling to make sure that everybody on the inside has all the data they need to do new and exciting things, and yet they don't want to tell the world about the new products they're developing and the new strategies they have. And so they have very clear rules on what can be shared and what can't be. I do think there are companies, there are businesses that are going to ignore transparency. They're just going to do everything they can to keep everything locked up. And that's in many cases for regulatory reasons or if you're a defense contractor and half of what you do is classified, you clearly aren't going to be putting out detailed bios on what all of your employees are working on. Apple does it because they like to generate buzz by putting new exciting things out the door and making a big to-do about it. The problem, though, is that there is leaking going on. People are doing a much better job of finding out what Apple's plans are. In some cases, they're getting information from vendors who are working with Apple, contractors. Other cases, they're just talking to loose-lipped engineers. So I think in the long run, companies are going to have a harder and hard time doing what Apple's doing. I mean, Apple has other advantages. I'm not saying that transparency is the answer, but particularly in businesses where you have to be part of an ecosystem, where your success depends on 10 other companies working with you, transparency is going to be a competitive advantage.
Thank you very much. I definitely look forward to hearing you expand on Monday, September 19th, part of the Jumpstart program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should give some context to the Strata Jumpstart event. This is a new thing we're doing in New York, and the basic idea is to take a look at many aspects of running a business, from strategic to functional, and how in a data society the game has changed. That leads us on very nicely to our next speaker, Kathryn Dekas from Google. Kathryn's worked with the People Analytics Group in Google since May 2008, and she's currently the project manager for Google Geist, which is Google's annual employee survey. And she also leads basically the project to create the onboarding experience for new Google hires. So she's here to tell us about how Google make people decisions with data. Thanks very much, Kathryn.
Thank you. I think our introduction from Michael is a really good segue into the kinds of things that Google does with data internally, even if we maybe appear like a lobster and don't share as much externally. But I'm really excited to be here today. I'm even more looking forward to seeing everyone in person in New York in September, so thank you. But we'll move now from talking about controlling and protecting data into kind of a specific use for how to use data within a company. And today and in September, I'm going to shed some light on how we use data here at Google to make people decisions in particular and influence action. So specifically, how to make use of data within the HR function. So as was just mentioned, I work in a group called People Analytics here at Google. It is the data and research arm of our HR department, which we refer to as people operations, which kind of cues you right away that people here really appreciate the data component of all of our functions. So rather than just calling it HR, we give it a name that's very similar to all of our other functions related to the operations of how we deal with people. So today what I'll do is share an overview of my group at Google, what we do, and I thought I'd go into detail about one example of how we've used data to drive decision-making and action. During the conference in September, I'll go into a little more depth about the specific framework and processes that we use to approach problems, engage with them, determine which data and analyses are most appropriate to apply to each one, and then how we use it to drive decisions. But today I thought it'd be hopefully interesting for you to hear a little bit about one project in particular. So first, before we dig into this project that we did, I thought it'd be helpful to have some context about Google as a company, because there are certain things that are inherent to our culture and our history that have helped shape where we are today and how we're able to use data in this way. So as of today, we have about 24,000 Googlers. This is what we call our employees here, in more than 60 offices around the world. We're turning into a bigger company, but as you probably know, we started out as a very small tech startup founded by 2 engineers. And as we all know, engineers value data. So as such, one of our core tenets of the culture from the very beginning across functions was that we would be very data-driven. And so to shape and influence action here from the beginning, you really have to speak the language of data. That's the bottom line. That's how the company grew, and that's what will help you make an impact. So along with that, there's a healthy appreciation here for being unconventional when it's useful to be. You know, we don't do things the way they've always been done just because they've always been done that way. So even in 2004, when we IPO'd, the letter from the founders started off by saying, you know, Google is not a conventional company, and we do not intend to become one. So in combination, kind of taking this really strong appreciation for data and kind of appreciation for being unconventional, these two things really pushed the development of our HR function in a way that was sort of different from how a lot of other HR functions evolved over time. So historically, many companies haven't necessarily relied on data to the full extent when making people or HR-related decisions. At Google at the beginning, it wasn't a question of adding data to HR. It was more of an expectation that HR would be done with data, just as every other area of the company used data. And so it was really how we grew up. It wasn't something that we integrated later. And I mention that because I think it's one of the key differentiators, perhaps. It's an assumption that we will do this and an expectation. So in terms of how this is done, as I mentioned before, I'm part of a group called People Analytics, and it's a distinct group within HR. And our mission, we always say, is to ensure all people decisions at Google are based on data and analysis. We're composed of three types of people. We have some folks who have PhDs in organizational behavior or psychology. We have MBAs with a strong focus on quantitative stuff, but particularly in the human capital or HR arena. And then we have a group of people who are really strong experts in data mining and different kinds of analyses that will help with that. So that's kind of what our group looks like. In terms of what we mean by people decisions, this could range from hiring to talent management to benefits, compensation, any of the main kind of functions within HR. We try to apply as much data and thought as possible to. So in terms of how seriously we really take this, this isn't just part of the fabric of our culture, but it's also built into the structure of the HR department. And so we use what's kind of like a hub and spoke model where Laszlo Bach, our head of HR, is the middle and the hub, and then all of the major HR functions report to him, including analytics. And so that kind of indicates to us that it's a big area of focus. Often the analytics groups within HR will report up through other areas, so through staffing or through benefits, through something else. And here it's taken so seriously that we report directly into the VP of HR. We also have one person on our team who's directly the point of contact for each of those other functions within HR. So for example, talent management, benefits, staffing, et cetera. One person on our team is specifically dedicated to each of those areas and really intimately knows the data available to them and also the goals and the interests and the challenges of each of those areas. So they're able to kind of bring together the data and the strategy and the challenges to start to think about how the data could be used to shed light on or influence the kinds of things we're trying to work on. So that's just a quick overview of kind of who we are. And what I thought I would do now is talk a little bit about Project Oxygen, which some of you may have heard about. It was actually profiled in the New York Times earlier this year. And in September, like I said, I'll walk more through the framework that we use to develop all of these kinds of projects. But for now, just thought I would dive a little deeper into this one. So if you're interested, you can actually look up this, the write-up in the New York Times. It was related to Google's people managers. So giving a little bit of history and going back to our engineering culture, one of the kind of unusual problems that we were facing a couple of years ago was that being a people manager here wasn't necessarily seen as a desirable position. So those of you who work in the technology industry, you know that what's really valued in tech companies is doing hardcore technical work. So being a people manager may not always be seen as aligning with that. So at Google several years ago, we actually did away with people managers in many parts of the organization as kind of a, hey, let's experiment with this. Do we really need managers? And as you can all imagine, this did not work out too well. And they brought the managers back, but the stigma of being a manager remained. And so there was this kind of anecdotal assumption that managers didn't matter. And so what our team did was we kind of undertook a study to understand if managers really did matter in any measurable way, and if so, how they did and how we could improve them. So at the beginning, we looked at the data that we had already. There are thousands of people managers at Google. We wondered, are they really that different? How can we quantify who's good, who's bad? And so we looked at two sources of data. One was Google Dice, which is our annual survey, and the other was scores on managers' performance reviews. And, those of you who are working in companies now will know that these aren't really particularly unique data sources. Many or even most companies probably have an annual employee survey and probably rate employees' performance. And so this is something that, many companies could do. And we chose these because we wanted to get two signals on managers. We wanted to get a bottom-up view from their direct reports, and we got that through Google Dice, their annual survey, which asks employees to rate their managers. And we wanted to get a top-down signal as well from managers to get a perspective on the impact that managers had. So we plotted these two data sources against each other, and at first blush, it looked like managers were doing pretty similarly. There was kind of a big, tightly clustered group of people who had seemingly similar scores on these two measurement sources. So what we did then was we parsed people out into the top and bottom quartiles to look at the differential impact, if any, that people who were doing exceptionally well versus those who were really struggling, the differences between the impact that they had on their teams. And it was really astounding. So we used regression analysis to look at this influence. And what we found is that the top scoring managers, so kind of our best managers, had happier employees. They were less likely to leave, they were more productive, all kind of the big outcome variables that you look for. We also looked at employees who had moved from good to bad managers or bad to good to get some insight into the causality here, and the results held up. So this was pretty interesting to us. We kind of had this academic exercise that showed us that, okay, managers appear to matter, right? But although this was interesting insight, it didn't help us act on anything, right? We didn't know how the managers got to be good managers or what the bad managers were maybe doing wrong or what kind of situations they were in that were really giving them a challenge. And so the next step was to collect new data. And so at that point, we conducted a series of double-blind interviews. And so what we mean by that is that neither the interviewer nor the interviewee knew which category they were in, good or bad manager. And we used that information to identify what kinds of behaviors our best managers did compared to those of our worst, so to speak, or our managers who were really, struggling. And then what kinds of pitfalls the ones who were struggling with were facing systematically. So where we went from there is we coded the data using systematic qualitative coding methods, and we came up with the 8 behaviors that have been profiled in the paper on what makes a good manager. And I won't go into them all here, but you can see them if you Google them, or just a couple are, manager is a good coach, he or she empowers the team, doesn't micromanage, they express concern or interest in their team's well-being, and they show important technical skills that help them advise their team. So those are just a few. In terms of pitfalls, we found that some of the situations that were the toughest were when a manager had a really tough transition. So They were suddenly promoted. They had to suddenly maybe manage people who used to be their peers. Perhaps they had a tough transition coming from outside Google, and then they had little training when they got here about the culture or how things work here. So tough transition was a really common one. Or another really consistent pitfall was the person lacked a consistent philosophy regarding performance management or career development. Or finally, a lot of people were just spending too little time on managing, and that was something that was pretty common. So these were the things that we found in terms of behaviors that were kind of common amongst our best managers and then common amongst the ones who are really struggling. And what we did with that is try to then feed this information back into different programs to help our managers improve. So here's where we kind of moved from taking the data and understanding it into driving action. And so what we do now is we have a semi-annual upward feedback survey where the questions align directly with the behaviors that we know are, exemplary here. So we have all direct employees rate their managers on these 8 behaviors plus an overall question about would they recommend their manager. And then that data is given to managers. And what we found is that even just having the information about how they're doing helps managers improve. But even taking that a step further, just talking about the transparency internally that Michael spoke of just in the past talk, we strongly encourage managers to share their scores and their reports with their teams and then discuss what's going well and how to keep improving. And so this culture of transparency does help us in a lot of areas here because managers are very much held accountable for their results on the surveys. So after assessing the managers through the surveys, we also annually award a Great Manager Award. And so we obviously want to recognize and reward the people who are doing these things very well and show how much we value the work that they're putting in. And so we use a Great Manager Award to do that. We also look at the Great Manager Award submissions to help us keep understanding what kinds of things people value in their managers to make sure that these 8 behaviors still capture the things that are indicative of a good manager here. After that, we've designed a lot of training courses around these 8 behaviors that help managers who are struggling in a particular area. So if you get your upward feedback scores and you're really struggling on, say, communication, you can look specifically for training courses that are aligned to that behavior and target that directly. So it's very helpful in terms of quickly kind of developing some new skills in an area where you know you're kind of maybe a little bit deficient. And then last, what we try to do is set regular expectations with managers. So using this information that we know to be true based on the data, we regularly send communications around, this is an opportunity to demonstrate XYZ behavior, which we know is important based on Project Oxygen. So we try to weave that into everything that we do. So that's kind of just a quick summary of one project that we've done based on data here. And during the conference in September, like I said, I'll walk through kind of the framework that we use to take on these kinds of projects and also give you a couple of other examples of ways that we've used data to drive action and make decisions here at Google. So hopefully that gives you a little taste. And if you have any questions, happy to answer them now, or also happy to respond to emails afterward if you'd like. My first my email address is my first initial and my last name, so kdekas@google.com.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. I think we have time for a couple of questions that have come up on the chat as you've been talking.
Sure.
The first one, Jason Davis is asking, do you fall foul of any kinds of anti-discrimination laws if you just blindly use sort of data mining? What's the interrelation between doing analytics and the law?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the short answer is that we work very, very closely with our lawyers all the time. We want to make sure, obviously, that we're in full compliance with any, not just discrimination, but any kinds of laws that might, relate to any of the analyses that we're doing. So yes, they're fully involved. And I would definitely recommend, if you're thinking about creating an analytics function, to do so in conjunction with your legal department or whomever is, in charge of the diversity and inclusion functions in your organization.
That makes sense. A question from Michael Nelson, previous speaker. He's asking, why is it that Google outwardly shares so little information about employees? It's, we talk about Google as a lobster. Sometimes it feels a bit like an octopus. There are many tentacles, but you're not quite sure whether they're all connected. And how is it, sometimes it's impossible from the outside to try and route to the right person.
Yeah. I wish I could give you a really solid, good answer about this. I actually personally am not involved in those decisions, and so I'm not sure. I will say that, of course, in a culture where knowledge is our business and intellectual property is, our bread and butter, we have to be pretty careful about the kinds of things that we're working on, and even just talking about the team a person's working on or the project, it could shed light on kind of our business strategy. And so, I can't necessarily give you the total answer on that because I'm not involved, but that would be my hypothesis.
Right. I have noticed since Google Plus was launched, that the team there has quite a different strategy. Everyone, all the people working on different features have been pretty upfront and personally available, and the data liberation front group also has that similar kind of strategy. So it seems that it might be applied where it's useful to apply it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Absolutely.
Yeah. I've got just one more question here. We didn't really talk on the hiring process, but could you, in a couple of sentences or so, maybe summarize how data is used when you're selecting candidates?
Sure. So I would say that data is used absolutely throughout. It's almost impossible to touch on all of the ways that it's used. I mean, from all the way to, from figuring out how many interviews a person should go through based on what we've found to be the optimal number to predict kind of performance later on, all the way through to, interview scores. We try to use data as much as we possibly can to give insight into, how well a candidate, stacks up against others. So I think if somebody has a specific question about how data is used in hiring, I'd, recommend you send me an email afterward, and I'd be happy to talk offline or direct you to the people who work really intimately with that.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate you sharing candidly with us, and really looking forward as well to hearing you talk on the Monday. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So before we move on, I'm just going to give a brief overview, and I'll keep this short because there's so many interesting speakers to hear of what's going on in Strata, New York. We're actually taking a whole week in New York to cover really the whole of the area of data in business and society and in tech. On the Monday, the Jumpstart, of which you've heard two speakers already, is really looking at kind of a remedial data MBA. Where does data fit into the various parts of running a business? And on the 20th and 21st, we have Strata Summit, which is much more of a high-level strategic look at how data is changing industries, it's changing government, it's changing science, it's changing world politics. And we have speakers including Stephen Wolfram, Paul DePodesta, who was he currently works for the New York Mets, so he was the numbers guy behind Moneyball. So there's a great example there of how data changed sport, and I think there are lots of lessons he can share that might be relevant to those of us who are just getting into data now. Matthew Bishop, who's the U.S. business editor of The Economist, is also going to speak. He has a fantastic thesis about the fact that we're probably measuring the wrong things economically speaking. Our macroeconomic indicators date from just after the Depression, and with the amount of data and crunching we can have access to now are the better indicators we can use to manage our economy. And also we'll have 5 startups that have just been selected from a larger group of entrants who will be pitching during the Wednesday and will be judged on stage and the winner selected. And then on the Thursday and Friday, 22nd, 23rd, we have Strata Conference, which is a real practitioner hands-on event with multiple tracks covering business, data science, UI interfaces, case studies, some more great keynotes there. So I hope as many of you can join us as possible. If you go to strataconf.com, you can register. And in the chat, I think Kathryn posted a discount for everybody who's turned up to this session. So thanks very much. Just a couple of competitions to talk about, actually, that are pretty relevant to our next speaker. A couple of companies are working with us to run visualization contests for dataset. So this slide here is talking about the one that we've done in conjunction with Tableau. So I recommend you go to the website link there to check out more of the entrants. And also with Juice Analytics, we're running a contest we're calling the Strata Visathlon, which, given food and nutritional data, something dear to all our hearts, what can you visualize to really explore deeper this relationship and tell a story? Very happy to have Nathan Yao of the Flowing Data blog, which if you haven't read it, you absolutely should, among the judges there on that competition. So I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Hjalmar Gislason from Data Market. So Hjalmar is a speaker in the conference. He's speaking on the Thursday, and the topic of his talk will be data visualization, where normal people fall in love with data. And we all know that one of the best ways of getting value out of the data and into our brains is through Viz. So Hjalmar, I'd love you to speak now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. So, as you mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about is this lesson that we've learned. We started this company, Data Market, about 3 years ago, and I believe one of the key lessons that we've learned in that time is that data visualization is very much where normal people fall in love with data. So when we founded this company on an idea that we've been throwing around for a while, the idea was quite simple. Addressing a pretty clear need. So what we had noticed is that numbers in many ways drive our world, but nevertheless, it's weird that finding and understanding numerical data, finding good data, knowing where it's coming from, and kind of understanding it to use in our business plans, decision making, or just to answer that burning trivia question can be surprisingly hard to find and obtain. And the problems we all know. Numerical data is scattered all over the place. It's on different websites in different file formats with different possibilities. You have PDFs, you have Excel sheets, you have web tables and proprietary systems online. And it ends up that people, even managers and specialists all over the world, are spending a lot of valuable time on the tedious work of cleaning up and manipulating data before they can even see if there's a trend or if the data is even what they were looking for. And this is true even of the data that you buy. If you kind of imagine analyst reports or market research reports that you kind of you buy and you pay often in the thousands of dollars to kind of get that data, they can also be really hard to work with. You don't really know what's in there, don't necessarily know what data is in there after you've actually bought the report. And getting the data out of the report, if you want to work with it in Excel and kind of work it into your models or your BI systems, or you even just combine things in Excel to make a chart with some of that secondary data combined with your internal data, this can involve quite a lot of manual labor. So we set out to solve this problem, to kind of address the needs of those of both data providers and data seekers by building an active marketplace for quantitative data. You could kind of imagine almost an app store for numbers. If you needed any numbers, you would come to this place, and as a data seeker and as a data provider, you would find this active place where you could actually put your data up for sale. This was the vision when we started out 3 years ago. But you probably noticed by now that I haven't even mentioned data visualization yet. And that was supposed to be the topic of the presentation. And that is because data visualization was simply not a part of that original concept. That was not the problem we set out to solve. We were solving the hard problem of normalizing data, providing unified access to heterogeneous data sources, and allowing numerical data to be sold and acquired, which we thought was kind of a task enough or task big enough in and of itself. But luckily, we were kind of smart enough and maybe bootstrapped enough to take on some consultancy projects in parallel with our development from day one, because it soon proved that there was a problem with the kind of original concept. And nobody seemed to care. At least that was the takeaway. One of the takeaways that we kind of originally had. It was no matter how clever we felt about kind of obtaining relevant data for our customers from obscure data sources, something that we envisioned that the platform would later be able to take care of, or how groundbreaking kind of analysis we thought we'd made and kind of insights we'd given the customers. They weren't that impressed. They were quite indifferent to it in many ways. But you draw them a pretty chart, even of kind of obvious facts. You're in business. That's where the spark comes in the eyes, and where people that's where the meeting where everybody sits up in the chairs and starts listening. So it turned out that the problem wasn't in the quality of our data acquisition or analysis. It was all about presentation, and we realized that we were onto something there. This may seem obvious to anybody that's listening into this, but we found that data visualization is really the way to bring numerical data to the masses. It's a way to turn numbers into insights and understanding for a wider audience than the kind of data nerds and people that are working with data all the time. Or simply put, as the title of the presentation says, data visualization is where normal people can fall in love with data and realize that there is something more underneath, and there is something in that data that can be of value. And we've actually found that this has very often been the almost the hook for us, or the trigger for doing deeper analysis or doing more even non-visual projects and non-visual solutions for customers, but it's still you hook them with a good visualization that gives them an insight that they haven't seen so far. And we've actually taken on numerous projects both for customers and on our own initiative that kind of that proves this point, or kind of has reinforced this point for us. I'm just going to run quickly through a few screenshots here. We took some demographic data that we could get from statistics offices and turned them into animated population pyramids. And it turns out that there are a lot of stories in this data. In the early days, like back in the 1800s, you will find stories about child mortality and kind of a very different society from what we have today. Then you have the baby boom, and actually in this still frame we're seeing 1963, a little bit after the war, so you can actually see how less children were born during the war, and then the baby boom after the war. And we can see, if we look at the animated population pyramid for different countries of the world now, we can see we can see upcoming things. We can see that it's after about 15 years, the baby boom, the people born during the baby boom will start retiring, and that will probably change society quite a lot. We can also see the difference between most European countries where there are very small young populations and kind of bigger older populations that are going into retirement. This will mean again societal changes in the future, and this is not something I see from the raw data. It's visualization, but the visualization kind of gives this to you right away. Another example that we did was that we're based in Iceland, and last year you probably heard we had a pretty big eruption when the glacier Eyjafjallajökull, or the volcano Eyjafjallajökull, actually blew up. And we decided to take some of the earthquake data that we could get from the Met Office. It's basically a live feed of earthquake data and that you get in raw form, and turn that into something very different, into a data visualization that will show you how the earthquakes were actually, it actually shows quite accurately how the magma is moving, because the earthquakes show how the magma is coming through the Earth's crust. And this data visualization made it to millions of TV screens on the National Geographic channel once we had visualized it in a documentary. So even obscure things like the national budget that you wouldn't think a lot of people are necessarily interested in, which is published in a format that looks like this by our government, and believe me, other governments don't necessarily do much better. We've done now for 3 years, we've visualized this in a very different format, in an interactive format where people can actually dig into the different ministries and the different spending accounts and so on. And we have people eagerly waiting for kind of our representation of the national budget when it's published in the autumn, which is quite a feat in itself, because national budgets don't tend to have large audiences. But one thing about this, and one thing that kind of we are very interested in, that all of these three examples, and actually a lot of other great examples of data visualizations out there, are one-off projects created using static data sets. And again, that's true of a lot of well-known data visualizations out there. Some of the best work by the likes of the New York Times and the Guardian. The one-off projects that have only a short lifespan, maybe a couple of days, where they go around in the social media circle and then they just lie dead and are barely ever viewed again. Even though many of them are actually made to shed light on statistics that are continuously updated, such as oil prices or gold prices, unemployment, inflation, and so on. And we are very interested in kind of making more generic solutions that will allow people that aren't necessarily data scientists like we claim to be, but more the general public, where they can look up the data and kind of gain insights on their own. We were not going to be a consultancy shop making one-off data visualizations, even though we realized that was a really important thing to do. So we set out to kind of integrate this idea into our marketplace and create a far more generic data visualization solution that you can actually see currently the current status of it on our website, datamarket.com. So what we've done there, just to kind of quickly tell you what's there, we've integrated data sources from dozens of the world's top data providers, such as the UN, World Bank, Eurostat, which is the statistical office for the European Union, and the IMF and other people. There are dozens of data providers already available there. And what this does is that because we read this all in, we normalize the data and make it kind of searchable there. It allows people to search, compare, download, and visualize the latest data from these great data providers all in one place. This means that, currently users can quickly find and visualize facts such as the rise of the percentage of the Chile's population that is connected to urban wastewater, such as the composition of the U.S. electricity production, such as the fact that the UK's 193 million air transport passengers in 2010 was the highest in any European country, and kind of several other facts. So there's quite a lot of data in there, more than 100 million time series at the moment of different data from more than 17,000 data sets spanning some 800 years. And what we're actually trying to do, as I mentioned, is to create a more of a self-service tool for data insights and data storytelling, so that people will be able to find and understand the best available data out there, allowing people to kind of gain insights and discover stories and actually share them too. Now, as you can imagine, this journey, just going through this and making tools for the generic part has taught us some more lessons, and it's actually these lessons that I hope to share with the audience at Strata. I'm not going to talk too much about the exact things that we've done and datamarket.com, but more the things that we've learned and kind of the tips and tricks that we have there. So not only how we learned that data visualization is where people fall in love with data, but also we've spent quite a lot of time studying the good, the bad, and the ugly in the world of data visualization. Some of the most beautiful visualizations, and actually some of the most famous data visualizations out there, are terrible and sometimes even misleading in kind of communicating the underlying data. At the other end of that spectrum, some of the people advocating best practices in data communication seem to be utterly unable to create anything that doesn't look horrible. So we'll share and discuss some examples of this and discuss the possibility of actually creating something that is both done right in terms of communicating the data and at the same time looks beautiful, which we believe can be done. Finally, we'll be talking about the technologies that we've chosen and why we've chosen them. We have quite a set of requirements when it comes to data visualization, and it turned out there were very few packages, even though there are a lot of data visualization and charting packages out there. There wasn't any single one that kind of fulfilled all our needs, so we had to do some compromises and do some additional development of our own. And we'll share some of that and kind of how we were able to address a big audience with a solution where we still kind of could control the visualizations down to the last bit. And a few tips and tricks that we believe we've learned during these 3 years of the learning curve that it is to start the company. So if you want to hear more about this, come to Strata. We look forward to seeing you there and sharing some more of our insights.
Thank you so much, Hjalmar. Really appreciate you sharing with us. We've got time for one question, and I think it speaks to what you were talking about just before. The idea of self-service and people being able to tell stories with data is great, except it's so easy to tell either the wrong story or to make data tell any story you actually want selectively. How do you educate people about basic statistics, about some of the things they need to know in order to tell as best they can a truthful story with the data?
Yeah. It's I don't remember whose quote it is, but it goes like this: if you torture the data, it will confess in the end. And that's totally true. There are a few things we're doing to address this, and we're very much aware of this. First of all, we, even though we are working on allowing people to upload data, at least for their own purposes, we only work with data from trusted sources, and we make sure that you can always go from the data on our side to the original data as close to the source as utterly possible. And in many cases, it will take you directly to the piece of data that you were looking at the original site, where you can look up the methodology and so on. But that's actually only half of it. The other half is actually understanding what you're seeing and knowing how to present it to best tell your story. And we are building in things like, we're already doing things like selecting or at least pointing you to visualization types that make sense for your data. But we are also, we envision that we will be educating people more as they kind of draw the visualizations. We will be educating them that, did you know that this type of visualization is best if you're communicating this or that type of data, or if you want to tell this or that story. So it almost becomes like a tutor on how to make and create good visualizations on top of the data as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's one of the powerful things of visualization is enabling people to get a feel for it, right? Being able to see what happens in response to them taking a particular action gives them a sense for data that just staring at a static image can't do. So I would love to thank you very much for your presentation. You can catch more of Hjalmar's saying on the Thursday, the 22nd, as part of the Strata Conference. Let's move on now to our next speaker. If you have any other questions for Hjalmar, I'm sure he'll be around in the chat room. So our next speaker is Michael Hugos. Very excited about his presentation. Michael's going to be part of the Jumpstart faculty, and he's talking really about supply chains. Now, supply chains are one of the parts of business that have most benefited from data and sort of operational analysis. And Michael's going to explain how using data can actually change the function of a supply chain and increase a business's profit. He works for the Center for Systems Innovation. So, Michael, thanks very much for joining us. I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yes, Ed, thanks for having me. I have been a student and a studier of supply chains for going on, 20 and some years. And when I started, a little story, they were really thought of as very simple things, which in many ways they still are. And a very wise warehouse manager told me one time, he said, supply chain management, that's easy. I stand here on the loading dock, and headlights means they're coming, taillights means they're going. What's so hard about that? So we've gotten to be a little bit more sophisticated since then. And what I want to do is I'll just touch on some of the main points that I'm going to talk about at Strata. Bring up that slide here. So the first thing is supply chains are often thought of as a cost center, which not that there's anything wrong with that, but you can also turn them into a profit center. And especially when you're in the IT world or the operations world and you're going up to the finance guys and asking them for money, they want to know what's it going to be used for, what's the result, and when you show them that you can use supply chains to generate revenue, you often get a much more friendly and interested hearing. So that's what I'm going to talk about based on personal experience. To start, I would say that we're in a situation right now where as we transition into this new century, we have historically, certainly for the last 100 years, been focused on efficiency. So businesses live on this continuum between efficiency and responsiveness. And what we really want to be doing now is talking about probably easing out of that mindset of efficiency only and moving into responsiveness. So again, this is where I start to talk to the money people and I talk about how data can make all of this happen. The first thing I say, because money guys typically are trained in efficiency, is I say that efficiency is good, but it requires predictability and stability, both of which are conspicuously absent, and we all know that. So when they go, all right, so where are you going? I will tell them that it's really by moving more towards the responsive side of the continuum, we are going to generate cash, and then they say, well, How is that? The first thing I point out to them is that when we work on responsiveness, we can differentiate ourselves. We are no longer just another supplier of some products. And I'll tell a story about a very generic product that we supplied. The whole idea of using data is to make your world come alive. I would say responsiveness requires data, and without data, responsiveness is absolutely dangerous. You'll just be driving off a cliff, most likely. So what happens is you start to put data to work, and when people start to think that perhaps I'm becoming a little too abstract, I remind them of I live here in Chicago, and there is a fine Chicago company that about 10 or 12 years ago owned the market practically in mobile phones. And that company has now just sold what remains of its mobile phone business to Google. And that company was absolutely, and probably up until, probably still is, they are the most efficient manufacturers of cell phones. They probably still make the highest quality, lowest cost cell phone in the world, and the problem is no one really cares. And so people don't really value it the way they once did. What people want now is a phone that responds to other things. When they started to first have their territory encroached on, it was a Finnish company, a little Finnish company that had never made phones before. They didn't take them very seriously. And then by about, the turn of this century, certainly if you were in your 20s and 30s, you wanted a Nokia. Then along came a Canadian company that made pagers, and Motorola knew who they were but didn't pay a lot of attention to them. And the Canadian company, came up with this notion of combining a phone with email, and all of a sudden everybody wanted a BlackBerry. And then probably the last nail in the coffin was a company that made computers. And what did they know about phones anyway? At least a lot of engineers at Motorola might have wondered. And they wound up coming up with something now that is pretty well defined the phone market, to the point where is it even a phone anymore, or is the phone just one of the apps that runs on this mobile device? So efficiency alone will kill your company. If you do not have the appropriate level of responsiveness, you're going to get into big trouble. And let me maybe illustrate that a little bit more with a personal story. The personal story really is that I was the chief information officer of the company that delivered all the paper cups to all the Starbucks stores in the country for 6 years. And we sold a lot of paper cups, but it isn't as if that customer wouldn't have been able to get other people to sell them paper cups. It isn't as if they weren't buying in vast quantities. We were able to sell those paper cups for 2% more than what the market price was, and they knew it. And why did they pay that? They were certainly a great customer, good people, but they were not interested in paying more money just to pay more money. So why did they pay that additional 2%? And here's where you can really start to make a point with finance people. What we did was we wrapped our paper cups with a tailored blanket of value-added services that was customized to the Starbucks business model. And it wasn't as if we did a couple of things that were just so gee whiz amazing that they said, my God, I got to have that. It was more that we came up with about 50 and some different things that we can do. We put together a group from HR, from sales, from customer service, from finance, from operations and IT, and I chaired that group, and we just brainstormed up all sorts of things that we could do to make our paper cups more valuable to each individual customer. We certainly used Starbucks as our main focus when we started this. And then we showed the salespeople how to go out and do a consultative sell. Make sure that what they sold was really tailored to fit the business needs of the customer, and don't immediately start talking about price. And then, and here's where it really became interesting, was as the CIO, the salespeople wanted me to come out and demo these things to Starbucks, and then I would be able to say, since I wasn't in sales, because they would inevitably start to like what we were doing, I would say, so don't beat us up on that last 2%, because that's where I find the profit to do all these things for you. It was an interesting experience. I certainly knew that the salespeople weren't bringing me out on calls just to be nice to me. They were very clear that the things that we were doing now were differentiating our products, allowing us to compete. We always had to be in the ballpark on price, but we did not have to be the lowest price supplier to start winning contracts, and that made a big difference. And it really points out the profoundly obvious observation, I suppose, that all products, all things are really composed of two aspects, and one is the thing or the service itself, and if you just focus on that, you get easily compared to the next similar thing, and then they pitch you against each other, and you wind up in a grim race to the bottom to see how low you can price your product or service, and then you don't make any money. The other thing that you can do is realize that all things and services have an information component. And what you do then is just make sure that you really tailor that information component to fit the needs of your customer. And then, in effect, when you say, what we would say to Starbucks is, that extra 2% is just sharing a little bit of the profit that we enable you to make by making our products so easy to use, to find, to pay for, to receive. So that is where I believe that certainly data becomes very important, because you need to know everything you can about your customer. Their needs change, and what is interesting to one customer is not necessarily going to be interesting to another customer. So you need to stay really focused on what your customer is doing and see how they evolve over time. So some of these, here's an example of the kind of value-added supply chain services, and these are all data-based for the most part. These are data-based. They have a strong IT component in all of them. And when you wrap your product with a tailored blanket of these services, that is where you start to employ data in a way that shows them the money. If we then move on to a specific story, which I was intimately involved in, and I call it the Tao of supply chains. And it was a situation where as the holiday season starts every year, Starbucks always goes into what they call their Red Cup season. They always have their special holiday themes. They are interested in, pretty much as November gets underway, they want all the stores to be serving their beverages in the red cups and using the other holiday-themed merchandise. When the holiday season is over, they want to basically have used it all up, because they're not going to use the same theme again when they go out the following season. And since we were the folks that delivered the paper cups, we were in a situation where they asked us, all right, how are you going to make things more efficient? In the past, there had been approximately 6% excess inventory left over. That inventory basically was divvied up against each of the store balance sheets, income statements. So no store manager wanted to have excess inventory on their books, because they are bonused by how well they run each individual store as its own business. And they called us out and they said, well, you're the folks that deliver that stuff, so what are you going to do about it? How are you going to make this more efficient? This supply chain that you run needs to be more efficient. And we sat there in front of the VP of supply chains, and she told us that this was high visibility, and we were also at the time negotiating a new 3-year contract. And we sat there like a group of chipmunks on a log and said, yes, we understand. Let us get back to you on that one. And as we flew back to Chicago, there was a lot of discussion about what we were going to do. There was a lot of also discussion that even though we sold them a lot of paper cups and we made a good profit, it wasn't as if we were rolling in money. They had also given us about 90 days to respond, and their own IT department, as well as the maker of the cups, Solo Cup, had assured us that it would take far longer than 90 days and cost a lot of money to provide a solution. So what could we do? I decided that if we could deliver end-to-end visibility into the supply chain, from all the way from the solo cup factories out through our distribution centers and on to approximately 5,000 stores, that we would enable everyone to follow the flow of holiday inventory through the supply chain, make collaborative decisions, which was a pretty controversial idea. Typically what had happened in the past was that the information was funneled up to a small group of inventory planners who were at our company headquarters and at Starbucks company headquarters, and then everyone else was, as they say, treated like a mushroom. That means kept in the dark and fed BS. And then orders would go out and people were expected to just follow orders, but of course what would happen is the data would overwhelm people. Even the people who were seeing everything would become overwhelmed, and they were often reluctant to make decisions for fear of being wrong, so they would wait until the last minute, and then they would suddenly issue urgent orders, and there was a lot of alarms going off and hollering and hand-waving, and by the time the season was over, we all swore we wouldn't want to do it again. So instead, what we did was we took the approach of let everybody see what's going on. Watch the inventory levels at the factories, the distribution centers, and out at the stores. We were the distributors. It was our trucks that moved the product from the factories through the distribution centers and out to the stores. So we pretty much knew what was going on. We asked the factories, the suppliers, to basically, in this first 90 days, since we didn't have forever, just send us text files, or if they wanted to even just type in to specially formatted spreadsheets and then attach it to an email and send that to us. And we had a little automated routine that would either read in the text files or pull the email in and take the spreadsheet and pull the data out of the spreadsheet and populate a big central database. And then we arranged it so that the database would open. We showed everyone how to set their browsers, so when you came to our website, typed in your name and password, you would then it would open up as a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet would populate with the data, and there would be a tab for the factories, another tab for the distribution centers, and then tabs for the regions, and then rows within those regional tabs for each of the stores. It was refreshed every night, so on a 24-hour cycle, and this was revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. It almost gave us all, I don't want to be corny, but it gave us this warm and fuzzy feeling, because what had been in the past an increasingly argumentative and ill-tempered process of moving inventory around during the holiday season became a collaborative problem-solving exercise. And certainly as I participated in that, it began to bring out aspects that I think all of us really like to do, this joint studying of the data, and we were displaying the data basically in a spreadsheet. Everyone had a copy of that spreadsheet. The master copy resided at our headquarters, but everyone else had a clone of that. When we wanted to look at assumptions, like we were basically trying to project the next few days by a rolling average, and sometimes we would use a 1-week rolling average. Otherwise, we might switch to a even 3-day rolling average, depending. But we could literally make the change by just simply changing the macro in the spreadsheet, and then let the spreadsheet roll out its numbers again and watch everyone see what the effect was. And interestingly enough, it was easier for a large group that was all able to see the same data to make decisions. This is quite counterintuitive. It was easier for the large group to make decisions than for the small group. And the reason was simply that when everyone was in on making the decision, there wasn't the reluctance to act, because no one person was going to get blamed if it was wrong. And given that we were all looking at good, timely data, and we were all street-smart practitioners anyway, our hunches were right, and when we backed them up with the data, so when we made decisions to move inventory, because inventory was often needed in places for reasons we never could have predicted, we would maybe pre-locate a lot of data up in New York and then not so much down in Atlanta, and then for whatever reason they weren't drinking coffee like we thought in New York, but they're going great guns in Atlanta. In the old days, people were reluctant to make the call to shift inventory from New York to Atlanta, often until it was painfully obvious, giving us 2 or 3 days, and we would do what to move the paper cups? One guess. We would air freight paper cups from New York to Atlanta because we wanted to keep our customer happy, but the cost of doing that was now eating into our profits, and we were losing money every time we did it, and yet the dynamics of the old way of doing things tended to push decisions to the last minute. This process of sharing the data, letting everyone see what was going on, and let me just show you a little example of what I mean by that. Basically, and I'll go into a lot more detail in New York at Strata. I'll show you in New York. I'll show you some of the actual screens and the spreadsheets and that type of stuff. But conceptually, here's what's going on. We are monitoring that constant flow of data all the time. We're visualizing it in real time. In this case, it's a 24-hour snapshot, but still, compared to what it replaced, this was like real time. And what happened was people started to see the trends early. We would agree collectively to move inventory from one place to another place, give ourselves enough time so we could put it on a train and not totally destroy our profit margin in doing so, and we were almost always right, The net of it was, in the very first year, by Starbucks' own admission, we saved them about $400,000, and then what they wanted to do was begin using this process year-round, not just for the seasonal inventory, and we incrementally, just continuously, in an agile IT development type of mode, as business needs emerged, we just incrementally continued to improve this system. And that really made a large impression, certainly on me. And some of the other speakers have mentioned things, like transparency. I think Michael Nelson mentioned transparency equals accountability. I couldn't agree more. Hjalmar talked about data visualization. We got into a lot of interesting data visualizations. I can talk about that in New York as well. Those are the things that really make a difference. So I would say that we need as a group of, as an economy, we need to move from an efficiency focus to a responsiveness focus. And responsiveness happens when you have data and when you share it and when you promote visibility and transparency. So that's the overview of what I'll talk about in New York.
Thank you, Michael. That's enlightening, a fascinating and I think exciting story. What I wanted to ask is, you've done a lot of work, and you mentioned agile responsiveness, collaboration. Do you think this pattern that you've identified in supply chain is something that other people can replicate easily? Do you think this could be spread with a certain amount of ease, or are there magic ingredients, that are required to get a collaboration like this going?
And I don't want to sound stupid, and I hope I don't have people rolling their eyes in the audience. This promotes I think, a collaborative instinct that is born into us humanoids, us Homo sapiens, and probably the other primates have it as well. And when you provide data, it starts to generate some of the same dynamics, very similar dynamics as what you see in massively multiplayer online role-playing games like World of Warcraft or EVE Online. Everyone had a reason to care about this. We as the distributors cared about making it better because we would make more money. Starbucks cared about it because they would make more efficient use of the inventory and they would never run out of red cups during the season. The manufacturers began to really buy into it because they could see where their product was going right down to the final store. Before, all they knew was they shipped a couple of truckloads to a certain warehouse and that's all they knew. So this, I believe the hardest thing to do is to get over the other human tendency to be secretive, and some of the other speakers have talked about that. Is that, and sometimes there are reasons to be secretive, and I don't want to come off sounding like a naive in this area, but the more sharing of data, the better, and it will bring, as long as everyone has a stake in the outcome, it will create an amazing collaborative spirit. And when street smart professionals are all looking at the same data and it's timely and accurate, they will start collectively making better decisions. And from personal experience, I can tell you it is an exhilarating feeling.
Thank you very much. I can, the excitement in your talk is really coming across. So hopefully, I'm really looking forward to hearing more. It's on the Monday, the 19th of September, again, part of Jumpstart. Thanks so much for sharing your time and insight with us, Michael.
You're very welcome.
So I'm going to move on to our final speaker now, who will talk and take us through to the end at around 10:55. Bill Schmarzo, I met earlier this year. He works for EMC, and I was attending a data science summit that some folks at EMC Greenplum had convened, and there was a panel of consultants who were asked to talk about their experience in deploying big data solutions and so on. And Bill really stood out as somebody with an immense amount of pragmatism and experience, and so I really wanted him to share what he's called proven techniques for exploiting big data analysis. For many of us that are coming into big data just now, there's lots to learn, but for people who have been in the data warehousing and business intelligence and analytics worlds for a while, there's over 2 decades of history there. There's a lot of principles, a lot of experience that translates over. So I'm very excited to hear what Bill's got to share with us. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks, everybody. What I want to talk about is just kind of to provide at a high level sort of the things that I plan on covering at the Strata conference. First thing I want to talk about is, as Ed talked about, I'm a practitioner in the sense that I spend my time talking to customers and really trying to help them understand where and how they can leverage big data and analytics to drive business value, to really supercharge their business initiatives. And one observation that I've got is that it does appear, and I talk to the business side of the shop, that there's a genuine interest from the business stakeholders to try to take advantage of big data and the integration of advanced analytics to really make better decisions. They think about it as data monetization. That is, they're trying to figure out ways that they can take data and make more timely, more complete, more accurate, more frequent decisions that have a bottom line impact on the organization. I love Michael's example, by the way, the Starbucks story, where he was talking about how they were using data sort of surrounding the base product to augment the overall product experience. And I'm seeing more and more customers who really want to do that, who see opportunities there. And in many cases, there's actually a business mandate. And whether it's caused by all the trade press and all the stories out there, there's a business mandate from executives that we need to be on top of all these new data sources that help us understand how we can better interact with our customers, how we can better drive our products, how we can better manage our operations in order to drive bottom line impact. There was an interesting factoid that came out of the Business Week research about a year or so ago, and this research they did said that 77% of the executives they'd interviewed knew of bad decisions that were being made because of lack of access to timely or accurate or complete data. 77%, 3/4 of executives knew that bad decisions were being made. And now I think things like that and the realization that making decisions based on gut, making decisions based on what happened last year is insufficient in a world that's moving and as dynamic as it is today. My second observation, which, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise, but I was sitting in a customer meeting about a month ago, and the customer, we're talking about big data and analytics and trying to figure out how we could what areas of the business we could help them with. And the customer said, hey, I only have 3 questions I'm trying to answer. And I thought, wow, 3 questions? You can boil your business down to 3 questions. I really want to hear what those 3 questions are. And she said, who are my most valuable customers? What are my most important products? And what are my most successful campaigns? Now, as I thought about that, those are the kinds of questions that people have been trying to ask for at least the last 2 decades. And what's interesting here is the nuance in the terms valuable, important, and successful. For example, I talk about valuable customers. What does that mean? Does it mean the biggest customers from a revenue perspective? Does it mean my most profitable when I factor in the cost of the revenue they generate and the cost to service them? Does it include things like lifetime value? Am I actually looking beyond at the next level and trying to understand the net influencer or social impact that customers have? Now, the secret to answering those questions is really in the nuances of how the customer, or how the client in this case, define the word valuable. And I know, for example, in talking to a B2B customer just this last week, that they struggled to understand who their biggest customers were from a revenue perspective. Whether it was through acquisitions or new product introductions or whatever it was, whenever somebody at the high top of the organization said, how much revenue did we get from, so-and-so last year and how much have we gotten this year, the data minions literally had to go running around different systems pulling that data together. They had no way to answer that question really cleanly. And that's at the very, naive is the wrong term, but that's a very rookie level question to ask, and doesn't allow you at all to get down to the level of nuances about what really is a valuable customer. Same thing with products as well and importance. And so one thing we're going to talk about at the Strata is really to understand the kinds of questions people are trying to ask, and most importantly, the kinds of decisions they're trying to drive. For example, if I understand who my most valuable customers are, that impacts my marketing acquisition campaigns. That impacts my sales, upsell, and cross-sell campaigns. It impacts what I'm looking for from a churn perspective and a prioritization perspective. Understanding what valuable is, or from a product perspective, understanding what my most important products are. And, important might mean, units sold, or is it margin, or is it role within a market basket, or is it the role it plays in a conversion event, or is it role it plays in category management and flanking my premium price products. Understanding those nuances, those terms, because in the end, the reason why we're trying to answer those questions is because we need to make decisions. We need to understand how to, from a product perspective, how to optimize our pricing, how to handle our packaging and promotion and distribution of those pricing. So if you think about the power of the question, the power of understanding the question, think about it from sort of from a high level big data or analytics value chain, which is big data plus analytics, allows me to ask questions that until previously I could not answer, and those questions allow me to make decisions that in aggregate allow me to drive material impact to the business. So that's one of the things we're going to cover at the Strata conference, is really to understand from the business side perspective the importance of these questions leading to decisions, leading to ROI, and how big data and analytics can really help to drive that analytics value chain. The next thing we're going to talk about is a case study. So, by the way, I love this quote from Gartner here on this slide. I love the fact that big data will represent a hugely disruptive force during the next 5 years. I'm not sure why they picked 5 years, but 5 years works for me. Enabling levels of insights that are currently unachievable through any means. So there's this promise out there that users will be able to ask and answer questions that they previously could not. But what's interesting here, and one thing I'm going to talk about, is that we actually have a case study of what happened in the 1980s that could and should provide insights and guidance for how this new world of big data and analytics could play out for us. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the consumer packaged goods manufacturing industry and the retail industry basically ran their business on bi-monthly Nielsen audit data. Now think about that for a second. You had companies like Procter & Gamble and Colgate-Palmolive and Coors and Budweiser and Coke and Pepsi making their marketing and product investment decisions based on 6 sampled points a year. And they're using that data to figure out pricing, promotion, new products, distribution decisions, packaging decisions, right? 6 observation points a year, the basis point for figuring out how they're going to spend their money. In the mid to late 1980s, something happened, and a company called Information Resources, Inc., IRI, came along and offered retailers they would install free of charge scanners at their checkouts, free to the retailer, and all IRI wanted was that lousy data that came out of it. I mean, who would want that stinking data? And the retailers were elated with this. They were elated with this because they took their most expensive cost, which is their personnel, and were able to optimize the efficiency of those people, and what IRI got was friggin' gold. And what happened was this allowed this new level of detail in data, where data sources went from megabytes of data to eventually terabytes of data, allowed Procter & Gamble and Walmart and Frito-Lay and Tesco and General Mills to answer questions at a lower level of fidelity than they could before in the past. And what happened is that these leading-edge companies developed whole new generations of analytics-enabled business applications like demand-based forecasting or customer loyalty programs or trade promotion effectiveness or market basket analysis, things that could not be done before, all of a sudden could be done before. And what happened is that not only did some companies flourish and blossom under this environment, but the power of the balance of power between the CPG manufacturers and the retailers shifted. So we are going to spend some time at the Strata Conference tearing into that to understand what happened and how that had impact on an industry, how it had impact on different companies, and the role that at that time big data plus advanced analytics, or in that case maybe small analytics, had on changing the way companies worked and how they drove bottom line impact. I'm also going to talk about the critical role of a data scientist and how important it is for the data scientist to not be a bolt-on to an organization, but to really be integrated into the very fabric of the organization and understanding the roles, responsibilities, and expectations we have with data scientists with respect to how we're going to drive bottom line impact to the organization. So the last slide here, what I want to talk about and what I'm going to cover at the Strata Conference is we're going to walk through a technique for tackling the most important initial question that you're going to have to address in the area of big data analytics, and that is, where do I start? The challenge we face with big data analytics is there's probably no business problem out there that we can't impact with big data and analytics. The challenge is identifying those opportunities that have both meaningful impact to the business and where we have a high probability of success. We want to avoid, for example, projects where we're going to cure world hunger, right? Would have huge business impact to the organization, but the probability of success is 0. So we're going to walk through a process for helping understand and help to identify what areas to go after, what problems to go seek, and then we're going to talk about a process for how we're going to drive collaboration and alignment between 3 key stakeholders in the process, which is the business stakeholders, the IT stakeholders, and the data scientist stakeholders, and how we drive collaboration using a concept called a vision workshop and envisioning exercises to help drive alignment and collaboration amongst the different parties. Mike in a previous presentation talked about the power of collaborative problem solving. And I have been involved in many of these vision workshops where you've got the business stakeholders involved from sales, finance, marketing, store operations, logistics, etc., with the IT support team and the data scientists, and the kind of insights that spill out of those kind of sessions, especially when you've identified a key problem to go after, are amazing. And they really can help focus the company. So I know I'm running out of time here, so I will kind of just whet your appetite to say we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how we drive focus We're going to talk about how we're going to identify an organization's strategic business initiatives upon which to focus, and we're going to talk about using a concept like a vision workshop to drive alignment and to get the project started, pointed in the right direction. To steal a quote from Stephen Covey before I leave, the key thing about big data analytics is to begin with an end in mind, and that's what we're going to talk about at the conference.
Thank you so much, Bill. I think that's such a fascinating kind of take home. I remember Alistair Crowe, my co-chair on Strata, saying earlier this year that one of the big changes that big data and analytics brings it to leadership in particular is that the successful leaders and the most successful deployments are around people who know where to ask the right questions and what questions to ask. Do you think that's a fair thing to say, that that's probably one of the biggest determinants of success, the kind of questions you actually seek to ask in the first place?
Yeah, I'd say it's the number one thing. Was what happens is there's many different stories, but there's it's not uncommon to have some senior executive in the organization have their favorite pet project and hear about big data analytics and what's happening in some of these companies and decide they're going to go tackle that problem, right? Just because by magnitude of that person's will, that's where you're going to go after. And it may be the wrong place to start for a multitude of reasons, but yet you start there on a project that's on a path that's doomed to failure. And so you've got to pick the opportunities that both have material impact on the business, that is, it's going to actually impact the business, but two, you've got to seed success. You've got to pick an area where you know you can have a chance of being successful. It makes no sense to start off a project, heading down a project that may have huge material impact, but you know you're going to fail.
Well, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to hearing you unpack all the case studies. And you're speaking in the Strata Conference, which is the Thursday and Friday, the 22nd, 23rd in New York. Thank you very much for being with us, Bill. And I want to thank everybody here this morning. In private conversation, Michael Nelson, our first speaker, said if the conference is half as interesting as this call, it's going to be a fascinating 5 days. And I'd really like to echo that and thank everybody, both in the audience online and our speakers this morning. It has been a fascinating session and really filled with potential and makes me want to dig deeper into all of the presentations. So this concludes our webcast this morning. Thank you again for participating. Please leave feedback in the chat room, or you can message us on Twitter @StrataConf, or you could send me email directly. I'm Edd, EDD, @O'Reilly.com. Thanks very much.